If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The winter wind moved across the empty railway junction with a steady, cold force, brushing snow across the frozen ground. The valley was silent except for the distant creaking of the wooden signal tower and the low whistle of air passing through broken planks. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound carry too far, the kind that kept a soldier alert even when nothing seemed to move. Elias Ward stepped out of the tree line and crouched behind an overturned freight cart. 21 years old, thin but hardened from months in the field, he carried the fatigue of someone who had lived through too much loss in too short a time. He had joined the army after German bombings took his family in France during the early months of the war. Since then, he had drifted from unit to unit, always volunteering for silent, dangerous work because silence was the only thing he could control. He was now attached to a small Allied sabotage group operating behind German lines. Today, he was alone. The mission was simple on paper: destroy 3 approaching Wehrmacht supply trains, ammunition, fuel, and armored transport. They would reach the junction minutes apart. If they passed safely, hundreds of German troops on the Eastern Front would be resupplied. If they were destroyed, the local resistance would gain a brief but valuable advantage. Elias checked his explosives bag again. Even though he knew it was packed correctly, he felt the usual rise of pressure in his chest. Controlled fear, not panic. Fear kept him focused. He needed that now. The tracks ahead were half buried in snow. He moved along them slowly, walking with his knees bent to stay low. His breath formed brief clouds in front of him, and he kept scanning the valley for any sign of German patrols. Nothing moved. No voices. No engines. Only the sound of his boots pressing into the snow. He reached the abandoned freight shack beside the junction. A small wooden structure slanted to one side, as if tired of standing. He pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The lantern hanging from the ceiling chain swayed lightly when the wind hit the shack. A few crates sat in a corner, torn open long ago and left behind. The smell of damp wood and cold air filled the room. As Elias stepped forward, he stopped. Someone was inside. A woman, half hidden behind the crates, flinched at the sound of the door. She pressed her back against the wall, her coat torn at the sleeve, her right arm wrapped with a strip of cloth darkened by dried blood. Her breathing was shallow and tense. Her eyes stayed on Elias's hands instead of his face, afraid he would draw his weapon. Elias lowered his shoulders to show he wasn't a threat. "It's all right," he said quietly. She didn't move. Her fingers trembled against the floor. "My name's Elias," he added. "American unit." "You." After several seconds, her voice came out unsteady. Anna Kovacs." She spoke with the accent of the region, Hungarian, maybe Romanian. Her clothes were civilian, but her eyes had the alertness of someone who had been hunted for days. Elias recognized that look. He had worn it himself once. He stepped closer slowly. "You're hurt." Anna nodded, though she kept her distance. "I'm with the resistance. My group, they tried to stop a patrol 2 nights ago. We failed." Elias didn't ask for details. Her wound and the fear in her posture told enough. "You alone now?" he asked. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "They killed the others. I hid here when they passed the road." Elias exhaled through his nose, steady and thoughtful. He knew the Germans were still searching. Anyone connected to the resistance was at risk of execution. Leaving her here would be the same as killing her himself. But taking her with him brought its own danger. She could slow him down. The mission required precision and speed. He looked at her injured arm again. She watched him, waiting for judgment. Elias knelt beside her without another word. He pulled off his gloves, took a roll of clean bandage from his pack, and motioned for her to give him the arm. She hesitated, half expecting him to force her out, half expecting him to ignore her pain. Instead, he waited calmly. Anna finally extended her arm. He cleaned the wound, tightened the bandage, and checked her pulse carefully. His movements were steady, practiced. She studied him, his scars, his silence, the tired look in his eyes, trying to understand why a stranger would help her without asking anything in return. You can stay hidden here, Elias said, but stay behind the crates. If Germans sweep the shack, don't make a sound. Anna swallowed. Why are you here? Elias stood, picked up his explosives case, and opened it on the floor. I'm blowing the junction. Her eyes widened slightly. 3 trains. Minutes apart, Elias confirmed. If I miss the timing, the mission fails. Anna watched his hands as he began measuring wire lengths, placing charges into rows, and checking the firing device. She didn't interrupt. She knew enough about sabotage to understand how delicate this work was. The lantern cast a dim yellow glow over Elias as he crouched on the floor with tools spread around him. Every movement he made was precise. Every breath was controlled. But inside, his thoughts raced. He pushed down the memory of his family, pushed down the fear of failure, pushed down the loneliness that had followed him across every border in Europe. He forced his mind to focus on the junction, the trains, the timing, the safest escape route. Yet he kept glancing toward Anna, making sure she was still breathing steadily, making sure she was conscious. He didn't know why he cared this much. Not yet. But empathy came before logic. That was how he had always been, even when it hurt him. The distant echo of a train horn rolled into the valley. Anna's eyes lifted toward the door. Elias paused, listening. Another horn, farther behind the first. They're early, he muttered. He rose, gathered his charges, and secured the detonator inside his coat. Anna's voice was quiet. Will you come back? Elias didn't look away from the door. Yes. Stay hidden. He didn't say if I can. He didn't say if I survive. He just stepped outside, letting the cold hit his face like a shock. There was no more time for fear. No more time for hesitation. The first train was coming, and he had a job to finish. Elias moved along the edge of the junction with quick, steady steps, the snow crunching softly under his boots. The first train's horn carried through the valley again, louder now, echoing between the frozen hills. The rails trembled faintly, a reminder of how little time was left. He knelt beside the junction switch and placed the first charge beneath the metal joint, securing it firmly before moving to the second. His breath came out in short bursts as he worked, not from panic but from the awareness that every second mattered. The cold bit into his fingers, even through his gloves, and he forced his hands to stay steady. A single mistake in placement could weaken the blast. The mission depended on precision. He checked the wires twice, then covered the explosives with a thin layer of snow to hide them. The detonator cable ran back toward the freight shack, where he had planned to take cover, but the sound of engines approaching forced him to reconsider. The German patrols would sweep the area the moment the explosion went off. Staying near the shack could trap both him and Anna. He followed the cable only partway, stopping behind a fallen tree where he had clear sight of the tracks. From here, he could trigger the blast and reach the woods faster. The snow around him shifted lightly as the vibrations grew. He positioned himself low, holding the firing device between his gloves, his thumb resting on the switch without applying pressure. The first train emerged from the bend, a dark mass pushing through the snowfall, its lights cutting narrow lines across the rails. The second train was already visible behind it, slower but close enough to cause a chain collision if the timing was right. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, just focus, sharp and unyielding. A sudden movement to the left caught his attention. A German patrol was crossing the far side of the junction, their rifles slung across their shoulders. Elias dropped his head immediately. If they reached the tracks before the third train arrived, they would notice the wiring. He pressed himself closer to the fallen tree, letting the branches block their view. His jaw tightened. He needed the third train. Destroying only 2 would reduce the impact of the mission, and the resistance depended on the chaos that 3 derailed trains would create. The rising hum of a third engine finally reached him. He lifted his eyes, watching it approach from the opposite direction. Snow blew across the valley in uneven waves, making the engines appear and disappear like shifting shadows. Elias counted the distance between all 3, measuring the exact moment they would intersect at the junction. The Germans on the far side began shouting orders, pointing toward the tracks. They had spotted something, Maybe a piece of exposed wire, maybe the way the snow had been disturbed. They started toward the switch. Elias tightened his grip on the detonator. Almost. Almost. The third train slid into view exactly when he needed it. The first engine passed the buried charges. The second was seconds behind. The patrol reached the junction switch and knelt to inspect the rail. Elias pressed the switch. The ground erupted in a violent, controlled burst. The rails lifted from beneath the snow with a deafening crack. The first engine pitched forward, its wheels grinding off the track as metal tore apart. The second train slammed into the derailed cars with a heavy impact, sending sparks and fragments into the air. The third collided next, pushing twisted steel into a tangled mass. The entire sequence lasted only a few seconds, each one marked by the sound of tearing iron and falling debris. A wave of smoke and dust rolled across the valley, carried by the cold wind. Elias stayed low, shielding his face as pieces of shattered rail scattered around him. The patrol had been thrown off their feet by the blast. Some staggered up, shouting and scrambling for cover. Others didn't move at all. He didn't wait to see how many were still alive. He pulled the cable free, slipped the detonator into his coat, and ran toward the freight shack. His boots pounded across the snow, his lungs burning from the freezing air. The destroyed junction behind him filled with smoke that billowed in thick clouds across the valley. He reached the shack, pushed the door open, and found Anna exactly where she had stayed, behind the crates, tense and alert. She looked at him with the sharp fear of someone who didn't know if the blast meant safety or disaster. "We have to leave," Elias said. She tried to stand on her own, but stumbled. He caught her arm, lifting her carefully without rushing her. She didn't protest. The noise outside was growing, German voices calling out, boots striking the ground, engines revving somewhere beyond the smoke. Elias guided her to the back window. The wood frame was loose, the glass cracked. He pushed it open with one hand while supporting her with the other. "There's a path behind the ridge," he said. "Stay close." Anna took a breath to steady herself. She nodded. He helped her climb out first, lowering her gently to the snow-covered ground before slipping out beside her. The smoke from the destroyed trains drifted over the ridge, dimming the sky above them. Elias placed his hand lightly on her back to guide her forward. She limped but kept moving without complaint. The distant shouts grew louder. German troops were spreading out through the valley. Elias looked over his shoulder once, calculating the distance, counting the voices, tracing escape routes in his head. The forest was their only chance. Once they reached the tree line, the soldiers would have difficulty tracking them through the snow. Anna's breathing quickened as they moved, but she didn't break stride. The ridge ahead was steep, covered in thick layers of snow and dead branches. Elias pulled her arm over his shoulder to help her climb. She leaned into him, not out of weakness, but necessity. When they reached the top, the forest stretched out before them, dark, cold, and quiet. Elias guided her down the other side, where their footprints disappeared among the roots and brush. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them as the trees closed in. They didn't speak. Words would only waste breath and time. But the silence between them no longer felt like fear. It felt like commitment, two people moving together because survival demanded it. The forest closed around them with a heavy, shadowed stillness. Snow covered the ground in uneven layers, broken only by scattered animal tracks and fallen branches. Elias kept his pace controlled as he guided Anna deeper between the trees, careful to avoid open areas where the Germans might spot fresh footprints. The smoke from the destroyed trains drifted faintly over the ridge behind them, carried by the wind, but no longer rising high enough to follow. Anna leaned on him with more weight than before. Her injury was catching up to her, and her boots slipped slightly on the icy surface. Elias adjusted his grip on her arm and motioned for her to pause beside a thick pine. She rested her back against the trunk, her breath uneven from cold and exhaustion. "We have distance," Elias said quietly as he scanned the tree line. "But not enough." Anna looked up at him, her expression tense but attentive. "How far to safety?" He studied the forest, recalling the map he memorized the night before. There was no safe house immediately nearby, but there were places where resistance members had once hidden. Shelters built by hunters. Abandoned cabins. He knew they needed one soon, not only to escape the search parties, but to keep Anna from collapsing. "There's an old hideout north of here," Elias said. "If it's still standing, it'll give us cover." Anna's breathing steadied. She didn't question him further. Her trust was quiet, like her voice, but it held weight. They moved again. Elias led her through a narrow path between dead branches, stepping carefully where the snow was shallow to avoid deep prints. The forest grew darker as the clouds thickened overhead. Every sound felt sharper, the crunch of snow under their boots, the distant crack of wood shifting in the cold. Anna stumbled once, catching her balance against a tree. Elias immediately supported her, checking her wound with a quick but steady hand. The bandage was holding, but she was losing strength. She caught his wrist. "I can walk," she said, though the strain in her eyes told the truth. Elias tightened the bandage, tested the firmness, then nodded. "We'll slow down." He adjusted his pace so she could follow without losing balance. The tension in his chest eased slightly when he noticed the search noise fading behind them. The Germans had likely reached the ruined junction and were trying to understand what happened. Their pursuit would widen soon, but for the moment, they had breathing room. They pushed deeper into the forest until a cluster of rocks appeared between the trees. Beyond them, partially hidden under thick branches and snow, stood a small hunter's hideout. A wooden platform raised slightly off the ground with a narrow entrance. Its walls were worn, the roof sagging on one side, but it was shelter. Elias helped Anna step inside, clearing broken wood pieces from the floor. The interior was cramped but shielded from the wind. The air was dry and cold, but at least it was still. Anna lowered herself to the floor, leaning her back against the wall. Her shoulders trembled from pressure and pain. Elias knelt beside her, unwrapping a fresh roll of bandage. He removed her old dressing carefully. The wound was deep but clean, no sign of infection yet. He rinsed it with water from his canteen and watched her jaw tighten as she tried to hold back a sound. "You held up well," he said, his tone low but sincere. Anna looked at him with tired eyes. "I didn't have much choice." Elias secured the new bandage. His hands were steady, but tension sat behind his silence. He knew they couldn't stay long. German patrols could still sweep the forest and find signs of movement. He sat across from her, close enough to monitor her breathing. For a moment, the hideout's stillness allowed both of them to gather themselves. Anna studied him in the dim light coming through the wooden slits. "You didn't have to help me," she said. "You could have walked past." Elias looked at the floor for a few seconds before meeting her eyes. "I'm not leaving anyone behind." "Not again." Anna didn't ask for details, but the weight in his voice told her enough. She exhaled slowly, her tension easing just a fraction. Outside, a faint crack echoed through the trees, branches snapping under moving boots. Elias shifted instantly. His hand moved to the knife at his belt, his body lowering in instinctive preparation. He motioned for Anna to stay still. He listened carefully. The sound repeated 3, maybe 4 sets of footsteps. Slow, searching, spreading through the forest. Elias extinguished the small lantern inside the hideout and moved Anna toward the far wall where the shadows were deepest. He positioned himself beside the entrance, ready to act if anyone tried to enter. The footsteps grew louder, stopping near the cluster of rocks. Elias held his breath, listening to the muffled voices. German. They were checking the area. Anna's fingers tightened against the wooden wall. Her eyes fixed on Elias's silhouette, waiting to see what he would signal. The patrol lingered for several minutes, scraping the ground and examining tracks. Elias kept his muscles tense but controlled, ready for either silence or violence. At one point, a flashlight beam passed across the hideout's outer wall, lighting the cracks between the planks. Anna flinched, and Elias lifted a hand slightly, calming, steadying. Finally, the steps moved away. The voices faded. Branches snapped again, farther this time. When the forest settled back into quiet, Elias remained still for another minute, ensuring the patrol wasn't doubling back. Only then did he move toward Anna. They'll search the northern trail next, he said. We need to leave before they circle back. She sat up straighter, gathering her strength. Can I make it? You can, he said with a certainty that surprised her, but he meant it. We'll take the old river path. It's harder to track. Anna nodded. She pushed herself to her feet, and Elias steadied her with a light touch on her arm. Her pain was obvious, but so was her determination. They stepped out of the hideout together. The cold hit them again, sharp and direct, but the danger behind them left no room to hesitate. Elias led her toward the thicker part of the forest, where the trees grew closer and the ground sloped downward toward the riverbed. Their steps were slow, controlled, and deliberate. For the first time since crossing into enemy territory, Elias felt the faintest sense of direction, not just toward safety, but toward someone he knew he couldn't abandon. Snow thickened as Elias and Anna followed the slope toward the dry riverbed. The deeper they moved into the forest, the heavier the branches sagged under winter weight, narrowing the path and masking their footprints. The wind carried distant echoes of German voices, but they were no longer close enough to track direction. Elias kept his hand lightly on Anna's back, guiding her around roots and uneven ground, adjusting his pace each time she winced from the strain on her injured arm. At the bottom of the slope, the riverbed stretched like a long trench of frozen earth, surrounded by tight clusters of trees that offered natural cover. Elias scanned both directions before helping Anna step down onto the icy surface. The wind was calmer here, the air still enough for their breathing to sound louder than it should. Anna paused to steady herself. How far to the safe route? Elias eyed the narrowing bend ahead. Another hour to the ridge. After that, we'll be close. She nodded, though her exhaustion showed in the shaking of her shoulders. He tightened his grip on her arm and continued forward, keeping them close to the wall of trees where fallen branches hid their movement. The quiet lasted only a short while. A sudden, sharp bark echoed across the riverbed. Elias froze. Anna instinctively moved closer to him, her breath catching. More barks followed, short, urgent, coordinated. German dogs. Elias pulled her behind a large fallen trunk and listened. The dogs were not on the riverbed yet, but they were close enough that the patrol must have shifted their search pattern. The tracks near the hideout had likely given away their direction. He knew they couldn't outrun trained hounds. Not in Anna's condition. Not in the snow. He scanned the riverbed quickly, mapping every option. The slope to the left was too steep. The right side rose gently toward a cluster of thick trees and broken boulders. Better cover, but not enough to hide a trail. Then he spotted a narrow ravine ahead, formed by erosion years ago, barely wide enough for two people to squeeze through. It bent sharply and led toward another patch of forest. The walls were tight, the ground uneven, but it would conceal their scent long enough to break the dog's direction. This way, Elias whispered. He guided Anna toward the ravine. She moved with determination, pushing through the pain without slowing. When they reached the narrow entrance, Elias helped her slip through the first tight curve. The stones scraped against his coat as he followed, but the cover was worth the risk. Behind them, the barking grew louder, echoing between the trees above the riverbed. Snow crunched under approaching boots. Elias quickened his pace. The ravine widened slightly at the center, enough for them to walk side by side. He reached into his coat and pulled out one of his last remaining explosives, a small but powerful charge with a short fuse. Anna eyed the device. You're going to block the path. It'll buy us time, but you'll be close when it goes off. I'll handle it. She didn't argue. She trusted that he knew his limits. They reached the end of the ravine, where a wall of brush concealed the forest beyond. Elias carefully positioned the charge at the tightest point, wedging it between two rocks. He set the fuse, then turned to Anna. Go through the brush and keep low. Don't stop. Anna took a slow breath, nodded once, and pushed through the branches. Elias lit the fuse and followed immediately. They moved fast, their boots digging into the soft snow. The explosion hit just as they reached the thicker part of the forest. A heavy blast shook the ground, sending fragments of stone and earth collapsing into the ravine. Snow fell from branches above them in sudden waves. The dogs barked frantically, their path cut off. Anna stumbled, but Elias caught her before she fell. She steadied herself against him, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. The forest around them went quiet again, dangerous quiet, but safer than before. They walked until the sound of pursuit faded entirely. When Elias finally spotted a clearing surrounded by dense trees, he guided Anna toward it. The ground was flat, shielded from wind by fallen pines leaning against each other like a natural barrier. "This is far enough," he said. "We rest here." He brushed snow away from a small patch of ground and began assembling a concealed fire using dry pieces of bark and branches protected under the fallen logs. The flames grew slowly, barely visible from a distance. Anna sat close, but not too near, warming her hands while keeping her injured arm close to her chest. Elias watched her carefully. Her lips were pale, her movements slow. He reached into his pack and took out the last of his rations, a small piece of bread and dried meat. He handed them to her without hesitation. "You need it more than I do," he said. Anna accepted the food, but paused before eating, studying his tired face. "You haven't eaten since morning." "I'll manage." She broke the bread in half and held one piece out to him. "We share." Her tone was firm, not requesting but stating. Elias hesitated, then took it. The warmth of the fire reflected in their eyes. For the first time since meeting, Anna allowed herself a small breath of relief. "Why do you push yourself this hard?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, steady, genuine. Even now, Elias stared at the fire for a moment before answering. "It's all I know how to do. Some things were taken from me before I could stop them. I don't let that happen anymore." Anna's expression softened. She leaned slightly closer, not for warmth, but for presence. "You didn't let it happen to me," she said. Elias met her eyes. The exhaustion in his gaze didn't hide the resolve behind it. "We're finishing this together," he said. Snow drifted softly around them, settling on the branches overhead. The fire crackled faintly. For the first time since escaping the junction, the fear that pressed on both of them eased into something steadier, something built on choice rather than circumstance. Night settled in slowly, but neither felt alone anymore. The fire had faded to soft embers by the time Elias determined it was safe to move again. Dawn pushed faint light between the trees, revealing a path through the thicker forest toward the ridge. He stood slowly, testing his balance after long hours without rest, then leaned down to help Anna to her feet. Her arm was still stiff, her breathing uneven, but her steps were steadier than the night before. "We reached the ridge, then follow the slope east," Elias said. "There should be shelter." Anna nodded. She didn't ask how he knew. His certainty was enough. They left the clearing and moved between tall pines coated in frost. Snow fell in light flakes, soft enough to muffle their footsteps. The forest grew brighter as morning settled in, and the distant danger of German patrols felt less immediate. Still, Elias kept his eyes forward, scanning every break in the trees, guiding Anna around any open patches where tracks might betray them. As they walked, Anna glanced at him. "How much farther?" "Not long," Elias answered. "There's a partisan cabin ahead. If it's still standing, they'll take you in. And you, I'll stay until you're safe." His tone carried no hesitation, though exhaustion dragged at the edges of his voice. Anna watched him for a moment, recognizing the strain he refused to show. "You need help too," she said. "Not just me." Elias didn't deny it, but he didn't respond. He kept moving, pushing branches aside so she wouldn't have to. The ridge came into view, a long rise of snow-covered earth stretching through the forest like a natural wall. Elias slowed their pace as they approached the top. Beyond it, the terrain opened into a broad clearing where a small wooden cabin sat partially hidden among boulders and trees. Smoke did not rise from its chimney, but its structure looked intact. Anna exhaled, relief coming over her features. "We made it." Elias examined the cabin carefully from afar. He listened for movement, checked for footprints, and watched the windows for any sign of occupation. The stillness suggested no enemy presence. They stepped down into the clearing together. Elias approached the cabin first and knocked twice, short signals he had learned from local resistance groups. A moment passed, then another. The door opened slowly. A middle-aged man in a heavy coat appeared, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes narrowed at Elias before shifting sharply to Anna. "Anna," he said, disbelief breaking through his guarded tone. Her expression softened with recognition. "Merrick." The man stepped forward immediately, helping her inside. Two more partisans emerged from the back room, young, tired, carrying the bruises and scars of months in hiding. Their relief at seeing Anna was immediate. One of them brought water, another cleared space by the stove. Elias stood near the doorway, watching without interrupting. He felt the pressure in his chest loosen slightly. For the first time since entering the forest, he believed the danger had finally broken. Merrick returned to him. "You brought her out." Elias nodded. "She saved herself. I only kept her standing." "That's not small," Merrick replied. "You'll stay here, at least until nightfall. After that, we'll help you cross to friendly lines." Anna, now seated by the stove, turned toward Elias. "You don't need to leave right away." Elias met her eyes. The exhaustion on his face softened, replaced by something calmer, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. "I'm not leaving until I know you're safe. That's a promise." The cabin door closed behind them, sealing out the winter wind. The stove filled the room with slow warmth. Anna pulled her coat tighter and watched the flames reflect across the small space. She looked different now, still worn, still healing, but steadier. Merrick brought food, setting a piece of bread and warm broth in front of Elias. "Eat," he said. "You look like you haven't stopped moving in days." Elias accepted the bowl and sat beside Anna. She shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his lightly, not out of need, but out of choice. He didn't move away. Outside, faint echoes of gunfire drifted through the forest, far from the cabin. The war continued, but distance made it feel like something happening in another world. For this moment, inside these wooden walls, survival wasn't frantic or desperate. It was steady. Anna rested her head lightly against Elias's shoulder. "We're safe," she said. "For now," he replied. She looked up at him, her expression steady, grounded. "We will be." Elias let the warmth settle into his bones. Let the strain leave his shoulders. Let the quiet become something more than silence. For the first time since crossing enemy lines, he didn't feel alone. He placed his hand gently over hers. The cabin remained warm, the fire stable, the air calm. The war outside would continue, but they had reached a place where fear no longer controlled every step, where life could begin again. Elias and Anna shared the simple meal in silence, not out of tension, but because the moment itself was enough. Their long escape was over. They had survived, and a new beginning waited beyond the door.